What up, though? Library of Congress collection. Born in Slavery. Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938. Born in Slavery. Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 through 1938, contains more than 2,300 first person accounts of slavery and 500 black and white photographs of former slaves. These narratives were collected in the 1930s. Pay attention to the dates. Collected in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration, later renamed Work Projects Administration. So I found the slave narratives very interesting. So I started listening to them, and I listened to quite a few. I actually was listening to them every day. I guess I just liked hearing the elders speak about their lives, because most of the time, or in my experience, when I start becoming interested in hearing my elders speak, a lot of them had made the transition and passed away. So again, I started listening to the slave narratives because I wanted to hear the elders speak. And what I noticed was that what they were saying was edited. And I thought, well, they have to edit these narratives because they only have a certain, um, I guess, amount of time. And also, um, they only want a certain amount of information in order to make these volumes. Because if not, then the volumes would be too extensive, where I would think that you would make them as extensive as it takes. So when I was hearing the narratives and I would actually hear where the edit came in, and it would like cut off one of the brothers and sisters, our elders. It would cut them off before their story was over. So you ask them a question and it leads to other questions, just like at the beginning when I started doing my genealogy and I spoke with my family members. I had questions that I wanted to ask, but each question would lead to a conversation. The same as with the slave narratives. I heard the interviewer, they would ask them a question and they would speak, and it would switch to another subject. And I knew that they weren't done speaking on that particular subject that they were on previously. So I started asking myself, like, what is this writer's project about? And do they, in fact, edit what they're saying? Because if they're editing, then that means they're taking out some things that the brothers and sisters were saying, that the Americans were saying. Now, before we start, the main word here is slave. And as I'm sure you've heard, a lot of people, when referring to their ancestors or their elders who were born maybe in the early 1900s or in the 1800s, they'll, even if they don't know exactly who these people are, who their elders are, people will always say that I'm the descendant of a slave. And I want you to think about this because the word slave is synonymous with worker, laborer, employee. The word slave also comes from the word Slav. It's a group of Europeans or Afro-Eurasians or Caucasians. It's a group of people, the Slavs. You're not a Slav. The Americans or the American Indians are not Slavs. They're not a Slavic people. However, because slave is synonymous with worker, laborer, employee, then think about you. You gonna get up in the morning and go to work. You gonna go and slave, work, labor for someone else's benefit. Sure, it'll benefit you in that you will make fiat currency to be able to trade for some of the necessities of life, as opposed to getting those necessities from the soil. So, in fact, think about it. When you're no longer here, do you want your people to refer to you by the fact that you were a worker, a laborer, an employee? Maybe you do. Because when you introduce yourself to someone that you don't know, what does that person always say? And what do you ask them? You say, and they also say sometimes, what do you do? Meaning, how is your labor labeled? What do you do for labor? What do you do for work? What do you do for employment? What kind of slave are you? At the conclusion of the Slave Narrative Project, a set of edited transcripts was assembled and microfilmed in 1941 as the 17-volume Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States from interviews with former slaves. Understand what you just heard. Slave Narrative At the conclusion of the Slave Narrative Project, a set of edited transcripts was assembled and microfilmed in 1941 as the 17-volume Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States from interviews with former slaves. Does this change the way you see slavery? Does this change the way you understand what someone is labeled a slave? Does this change the way you understand what that means? I mean, this is coming from, quote, slaves, former slaves, end quote. But right here it said a set of edited transcripts. So this means that you're not getting everything that brother or sister said. You're getting what makes the project flow. In 2000 to 2001, with major support from the Citigroup Foundation, the library digitized the narratives from the microfilm edition and scanned from the originals 500 photographs, including more than 200 that had never been microfilmed or made publicly available. The published volumes containing edited slave narratives. If you don't know what the word edited means, look it up. Administrative files for the project are bound at the beginning of Volume 1. Administrative files for the project are bound at the beginning of Volume 1. These files detail the instructions and other information supplied to field workers as well as subjects of concern to state directors of the Federal Writers Project. Understand, these administrative files detail the instructions and other information supplied to the field workers, the people who were doing the interviews. They were given instructions, specific instructions. They were trained. They were basically trained. There's nothing wrong with that. You should know that. This is just something you should know when listening to the slave narratives. And another funny aspect of it are the narrators of the slave narratives, the people who are actually narrating and are the voice of the brothers and sisters who were actually being interviewed. And some of these people, trying to speak American like you and me. Just think about it. Think about one of these pink or gray people, or the Anglo-Saxon or the European or Caucasian or properly Afro-Eurasian speaking like you, trying to talk like you. Think about that. You've seen it. It's comical. And more seriously, it takes away from what these American brothers and sisters were saying, because it adds a bit of comedy to it, which there is nothing funny about someone basically speaking their autobiography to you. The interviewers then turned the narratives over to their state FWP director for editing and eventual transfer to Washington, D.C. The administrative files accompanying the narratives detail the information supplied to field workers as well as subjects of concern to state directors of the FWP. In 1939, remember the date, 1939. We're talking the early 1900s here. The FWP lost its funding, and the states were ordered to send whatever manuscripts they had collected to Washington. Once most of the materials had arrived at the Library of Congress, Benjamin A. Botkin, the folklore, if you don't know what folklore means, look it up. The folklore editor of the FWP, who later became head of the archive of folk culture at the Library of Congress, undertook the remaining editing and indexing of the narratives and selected the photographs for inclusion. I know you listening, but we've heard the word editing, okay? Quite a bit. We've heard the word editing. Editing is a thing. Now we move on to the administrative files. These are the administrative files. These are the instructions to the field workers. Okay, the field workers, we're not talking about your slave, your ancestors that was slaves that you call slaves, and some was working in the house and some was working in the field. It was a house nigger and a field nigger. We not talking about them. You don't even know if they was that. We talking about what the Library of Congress called their people who were doing interviews field workers. These are the administrative files, which are the instructions. Slave narratives. Typewritten records prepared by the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938, assembled by the Library of Congress Project Work Project Administration for the District of Columbia, sponsored by the Library of Congress. Washington, 1941. Federal Works Agency, Work Projects Administration for the District of Columbia. These are the states that I guess participated in the Slave Narratives Project. Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. On April 22nd, 1937, a standard questionnaire for field workers drawn up by John A. Lomax, then National Advisor on Folklore and Folkways for the Federal Writers Project, was issued from Washington as supplementary instructions to the American Guide Manual. Also associated with the direction and criticism of the work in the Washington office of the Federal Writers Project were Henry G. Alsberg, Director, George Cronin, Associate Director, Sterling A. Brown, Editor on Negro Affairs, Mary Lloyd, Editor, and B.A. Botkin, Folklore Editor, succeeding Mr. Lomax. Mr. Lomax served from June 25, 1936 to October 23, 1937, with a 90-day furlough beginning July 24, 1937. According to a memorandum written by Mr. Alsberg on March 23, 1937, Mr. Lomax was in charge of the collection of folklore all over the United States for the Writers Project. In connection with this work, he is making recordings of Negro songs and cowboy ballads. Though technically on the payroll of the Survey of Historical Records, his work is done for the writers, and the results will make several national volumes of folklore. If you don't know what folklore means, look it up. The essays in the state guides devoted to folklore are also under his supervision. Since 1933, Mr. Lomax has been honorary curator of the Archive of American Folk Song, Library of Congress. On August 31st, 1939, the Federal Writers Project became the Writers Program, and the National Technical Project in Washington was terminated. On October 17th, the first Library of Congress project under the sponsorship of the Library of Congress was set up in the District of Columbia to continue some of the functions of the National Technical Project, chiefly those concerned with books of a regional or nationwide scope. On file in the Washington office in August 1939 was a large body of slave narratives, photographs of former slaves, interviews with white informants regarding slavery, transcript of laws, advertisements, records of sale, transfer, and manumission of slaves, and other documents. The following material has been omitted. Most of the interviews with informants born too late to remember anything of significance regarding slavery or concerned chiefly with folklore. A few negligible fragments and unidentified manuscripts, a group of Tennessee interviews showing evidence of plagiarism. All editing has previously been done in the States or the Washington office. Some of the penciled comments have been identified as those of John A. Lomax and Alan Lomax, who also read the manuscripts. Some of the penciled comments have been identified as those of John A. Lomax and Alan Lomax, who also read the manuscripts. They say some of the pencil comments have been identified. Perhaps they were those of John A. Lomax and Alan Lomax. Perhaps not. In a few cases, two drafts of versions of the same interview have been included for comparison of interesting variations or alterations. A large number of surviving slaves, many of whom have since died, have been permitted to tell their own story in their own way, in spite of obvious limitations, bias, and fallibility of both informants and interviewers, the use of leading question, unskilled techniques, and insufficient controls and checks. This saga must remain the most authentic and colored source of our knowledge of the lives and thoughts of thousands of slaves. Don't forget, slaves as being separate from human has become big business. So much so that you will call your ancestors slaves. They don't even have a name. You don't even think to give them a name. You don't even say, well, Joe was a slave. You say, my ancestors were slaves. You don't say, my ancestor Joe was a slave. Or my ancestor Joe was my uncle, or my cousin, he was a slave. You just say slaves. To the point where you see the word slave, it's not even human. It's not even a being that sprouted from the soil. It's not even a being that has a story. It's just a slave, a worker. And to this day, you introduce yourself, and the first thing is your name. The second thing is how you slave. The title of the slavery that you participate in. Whatever job employs you, whatever business employs you. This saga must remain the most authentic and colorful source of our knowledge of the lives and thoughts of thousands of slaves, of thousands of workers, laborers, employees, of thousands of Americans who you call blacks and African Americans, of thousands of American Indians. This saga must remain the most authentic and colorful source. Saga, a couple of words synonymous with saga are fairy story and myth. Colorful means full of interest, lively, and exciting. Let's read it again. This fairy story, this myth, must remain the most authentic and interesting, the most authentic and lively, the most authentic and exciting source of our knowledge of the lives and thoughts of thousands of Americans. From the correspondence and memoranda files of the Washington office of the Federal Writers Project, the following instructions and criticism relative to the slave narrative collection issued from April 1st to September 8th, 1937, have been selected. They throw light on the progress of the work, the development of materials and methods, and some of the problems encountered. Sent to North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, Oklahoma, April 14th, 1937. To State Director, Federal Writers Project, Works Progress Administration, City Hall, 5th floor, Asheville, North Carolina. This is sent to Mr. Edwin Bjorkman. We would like to have portraits wherever they can be secured, but we urge your photographers to make the studies as simple, natural, and unposed as possible. They're speaking of how they want the photographers to photograph the brothers and sisters. They say, we urge your photographers to make the people as simple, natural, and unposed. Okay, think about when you see pictures of the Native American, the Chino, the Caucasian that they call the Native American. Think about when you see them with the costume, the Party City costume. Their goal is to make those people, look as simple, as natural, and unposed as possible. But they fail. Let the background cabin or whatnot be the normal setting. In short, just the picture a visitor would expect to find by dropping in on one of these old timers, on one of these Americans that you call slave. Enclosed is a memorandum of Mr. Lomax with suggestions for simplifying the spelling of certain recurring dialect words. This does not mean that the interview should be entirely in straight English. Simply that we want them to be more readable to those uninitiated in the broadest Negro speech. Do you hear this? Do you hear this? This does not mean that the interview should be entirely in straight English, simply that we want them to be more readable to those uninitiated in the broadest American speech. They're differentiating American from English language. And it has right here, Negro dialect suggestions, stories of ex-slaves, ex-workers, ex-employees, Americans, people who you don't even take the time to give a name to, your family, your ancestors. It says Negro dialect suggestions, or properly, the American language, the same language that you speak today. It says, do not write ah for I. Like if somebody say, F you up, instead of I will F you up. P-O-E, po, for poor. Hit for it, to for two. Like we going to the stove. We going to the stove instead of we going to the store. Was for was. Like, what's up? Like, what's happening? Like, what's popping? Bed for bed. Dead for dead. Owl for hour. Like like that's our stuff, not that's our stuff. My for my. That's my shit. That's my shit. Not that's my shit. Over for over. What time the party over with? What time happy hour over? Other for other. Other for other. Is that your stuff? Or is that other month? Where? For where? Where they going? Under for under. I don't know where them shoes at. I don't know where them shoes at. Look under the bed. For four. For four. This one for me, that one for you. Yonder for yonder. Master for master, or massa. Going to for going to. Almond for woman. Ifin for if. Fire or fire for fire. Fire. You know, like that song Fire. That song is fire. Or that song fire. Or we got a problem, go get the fire. Let's shake it. Other for other. Other for other. Yo for you. You. Yeah. Give for give. I give you this. Did they give you that? Forgive. Caught for caught. Kind for kind. Kind for kind. Cause for cause. Remember, this is the American, the Negro dialect, the American dialect. They did not want them to write that. So how could you have a proper narrative if they don't use the American, if they just use the English, right? The main purpose of these detailed and homely questions is to get the Negro interested in talking about the days of slavery, is to get the American Indian interested in talking about the days of laboring for another month. It will not be necessary. Indeed, it will probably be a mistake to ask every person all of the questions. Do not use dialect spelling so complicated that it may confuse the reader. The details of the interview should be reported as accurately as possible in the language of the original statements. How dare they give you all those restrictions and then tell you it should be as accurately as possible? Notes by an editor on dialect usage and accounts by interviews with ex-slaves to be used in conjunction with Supplementary Instructions 9E. Simplicity in recording the dialect is to be desired in order to hold the interest and attention of the readers. It seems to me that readers are repelled by pages sprinkled with misspellings, commas, and apostrophes. The value of exact phonetic transcription is, of course, a great one, but few artists attempt this completely. When they speak of phonetic transcription, think about it. When a census enumerator came to your people's dwelling in the early 1800s, and one of your family members, they asked one of your family members, what is your name? And then your family member looked at them, and your other family member said, tell them what your name is. And they told them, and the census enumerator in some cases, think about this, the census enumerator, they wrote what it sounded like, coupled with the English that they had learned, some of them that they had recently learned. Because understand, not all the census enumerators were Anglo-Saxons. They do have lists of these enumerators, but I'm pretty sure all of them weren't Anglo-Saxons or Caucasians or recently immigrated Europeans, because they had to go in rural areas. So you would want to send someone that the people didn't see as so much as a stranger, which you coming in somebody's spot. I mean, you a stranger, but it would make sense to employ someone who looked like you. But in some cases, the people didn't look like you, perhaps. So when they spoke American and the enumerator spoke recently learned English, bad English at that, they were coming from all manner of places. They were speaking German, Italian, and other languages. So when they heard your people tell them what their name was, the enumerator wrote what the name sounded like, as well as in reference to their potentially weak understanding of English. So let that sink in. Present day readers are less ready for the overstress of phonetic spelling than in the days of local color. Remember, local color, interest, excitement, local color. Authors realize this. Julia Peterkin uses a modified gullah instead of Gonzalez's carefully spelled out gullah. Julia Peterkin uses a modified gullah instead of Gonzalez's carefully spelled out gullah. We learned of Julia Peterkin, thanks to legendary Big Chief Top Cats for sharing with us his work on discovering that Julia Peterkin she began the idea of a gullah or a Gullah Geechee. You have to look into that. You have to watch his show on that. Feel free. But Julia Peterkin wrote about the Gullah Geechee. I'm not going to get into that right now. It's a very interesting. And you know the Ogeechee people, the Ogeechee River, you know Georgia, South Carolina, all that good stuff. Truth to idiom is more important, I believe, than truth to pronunciation. Truth to idiom is more important, I believe, than truth to pronunciation, obviously. Erskine Caldwell, in his Stories of Georgia, Ruth Suckow in Stories of Iowa, and Zora Neale Hurston in Stories of Florida Negroes get a truth to the manner of speaking without excessive misspellings. See, what the American Indian, what they said to these people was perceived when they wrote it as excessive misspellings. In order to make this volume of slave narratives more appealing and less difficult for the average reader, I recommend that truth to idiom be paramount and exact truth to pronunciation secondary. They don't think very highly of the reader. I should like to recommend that the words darky and nigger and such expressions as a comical little old black woman be omitted from the editorial writings. So already we're removing truth. We're removing the reality of things. Memorandum, July 30th, 1937, State Directors. This is to the State Directors of the Federal Writers Project from Henry G. Alsberg, Director. The following general suggestions are being sent to all the states where there are ex-slaves still living. General suggestions. Instead of attempting to interview a large number of ex-slaves, the workers should now concentrate on one or two of the more interesting and intelligent people, revisiting them, establishing friendly relations, and drawing them out over a period of time. Should the ex-slave, however, give only one side of the picture, the interviewer should suggest that there were other circumstances and ask questions about them. We suggest that each state choose one or two of their most successful ex-slave interviewers and have them take down some stories word for word. Some Negro informants or some American informants or some American Indian informants, some Negro informants are marvelous in their ability to participate in this type of interview. So this is from Google Translate. Cycles les Indiennes. Cycles les Indiennes. In French, translated to English, means Indian cycles. Cycles les Indiennes in French translates to Indian cycles in English. This rare Art Nouveau classic is a sight to behold. The rare art is the art that I'm going to show you after this description. This rare Art Nouveau classic is a sight to behold. Cycles les Indiennes, a French cycling company, was known in the early 1900s. Remember? We were just talking about the 1900s with the slave narratives, right? Now we're talking about what will follow after this description. Remember, Cycles les Indiennes is French for Indian cycles. This rare Art Nouveau classic is a sight to behold. Cycles Les Indiennes, a French cycling company, was known in the early 1900s to produce some of the best bicycles of the era. Expert craftsmanship, speed, and sleek framework are just a few ways to describe the immaculate bicycles that swept the nation. In this glorious two-sheet masterpiece, we see an indigenous woman dressed to the nines in native attire. She is pictured barefoot and quickly outpacing her pursuers on horseback. Wow, these bikes are fast. It's an advertisement. This is an advertisement, what I'm going to show you next. Let's go over how they describe the picture again. It says, in this glorious two-sheet masterpiece, we see an indigenous woman dressed to the nines in native attire, which means it is native, it is indigenous to where this woman is from. She is pictured barefoot and quickly outpacing her pursuers on horseback. Wow, these bikes are fast. Art by C.H. Duveau, published by Soulin and Dehaan Valenciennes. This extremely rare work of art is perfect for the cycling enthusiast in your life. Early 1900s. This is the advertisement, and this is the indigenous woman who you call black or African American. This is the indigenous woman, Cycles Les Indiennes, Indian cycles. And they are using an Indian. And we see her with her little natural, with the gold hoop earrings indicative of an American Indian. We see the crown of feathers, not the Party City, in the Party City Native American costume that you see every time you want to see an Indian of America. And she's on the bike, and she has her gold bracelets around the top of her biceps. She has gold bracelets around her wrist, gold bracelets around her ankles. And again, she has her hoop earrings. And today, this sister would be called black or African American. But she is properly an American Indian. And the French saw fit to use her in the advertisement for their Indian cycles, their Indian bicycles that were very fast. Okay. So I put in AI describe image at imageprompt.org. AI describe image. Okay. Guess a non-biased description of the advertisement, the image in the advertisement. As you can see, I have highlighted here the image that we just looked at, Cycles Les Indiennes, the sister with the natural and the crown of feathers and her bow, dressed to the nines, barefoot. Right? You've never seen a Indian being depicted like this before. AI describe image. As you can see, that is the image we just looked at. And here we have a section called custom question, which I did ask a custom question. And that question is as follows. Is the woman in the image American Indian or French? The description generated says, the woman in the image is depicted in a style suggestive of an American Indian. The poster's context and the woman's attire, including a headdress, further reinforces this visual representation. Man, do the right thing.